Hi there, welcome to Dreamy Histories channel. Tonight, we're drifting back to a misty June morning in 793, where you're about to witness one of history's most shocking wake-up calls. You're standing on the windswept shores of Lindisfarne, a holy island off England's northeast coast, watching strange ships with serpent-headed prows slice through the dawn fog. The monks around you haven't noticed yet. They're too busy with morning prayers to realize that in about 10 minutes, their entire world is going to be painted red. Here's a fun reality check. If you were actually there, you'd probably be face down in the North Sea within the hour, because these aren't traders coming to barter for your hand-copied Bibles. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing how far these bedtime stories travel. All right, let's begin the story. You feel the sand shift beneath your feet as those dragon ships beach themselves with practiced precision. The monastery of Lindisfarne sits before you like a jewel box waiting to be smashed open. And that's exactly what's about to happen. This isn't just any religious site. It's one of Christianity's most sacred places in Britain, home to the shrine of St. Cuthbert, and a scriptorium that produces illuminated manuscripts so beautiful they make grown bishops weep. The Vikings know this, of course. They've been watching, planning, probably laughing at how these holy men built their treasure house right on the coast with zero fortifications. I mean, who needs walls when you have the power of prayer, right? The first scream cuts through the morning air like a knife through butter, which, coincidentally, is also what's happening to Brother Timothy near the vegetable garden. You watch as dozens of warriors pour from the ships, their axes catching the early sunlight in ways that would be almost beautiful if they weren't about to redecorate the monastery in early medieval massacre. These aren't the horned helmet cartoon Vikings from your childhood. These are lean, mean, extremely motivated treasury auditors who just happen to conduct their audits with sharp objects. What strikes you most is the efficiency. While you're still processing the fact that yes, this is actually happening, they've already kicked in the doors of the main chapel. The golden crucifix that took 3 years to craft? That's going in a bag. The jewel-encrusted gospel covers? Also bagged. That incredibly rare purple dye the monks use for their most sacred texts? Well, they're not taking the dye, but they're definitely taking the texts. Turns out Vikings appreciate good literature when it's bound in gold. The mainstream historical fact here is that this Lindisfarne raid genuinely marked the beginning of the Viking Age in Western consciousness. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded it with unusual emotion, describing how the ravaging of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne. But here's the quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have found evidence that some Vikings might have actually tried to read the Latin text they stole, based on runic graffiti that appears to be hilariously bad attempts at copying Latin phrases. Imagine a bloodthirsty raider squinting at illuminated manuscripts by candlelight, trying to sound out Domini Nostri, like he's in remedial Latin class. You're crouched behind an overturned cart now, watching Vikings load their ships with everything that isn't nailed down, and quite a few things that were. The monastery's entire wealth, accumulated over 150 years of donations from guilty nobles trying to buy their way into heaven, is being transferred to new management in under 2 hours. Historians still argue whether this raid was a planned strategic strike or just opportunistic pirates who got stupidly lucky. But either way, the impact reverberates through time like a bell struck with a hammer. The real horror isn't just the violence, though there's plenty of that making your breakfast want to revisit you. It's the desecration. You watch Vikings overturn altars to check for hidden compartments. Use illuminated manuscripts as impromptu toilet paper. Yes, really. And play catch with sacred relics. One raider is currently wearing St. Cuthbert's ceremonial cope as a cape while he urinates on the altar. The spiritual violation feels almost worse than the physical one, which is saying something considering Brother Edwin is currently discovering what his own spleen looks like. As the raiders prepare to leave, dragging younger monks toward the ships, slave markets in Dublin pay well for literate servants, you realize you're witnessing the moment that changes everything. Word of this attack will spread across Europe faster than a medieval pandemic. Charlemagne will write angry letters. The Pope will have theological anxiety attacks. English kings will start having recurring nightmares about dragon ships. This isn't just a raid. It's the opening chord of a symphony of terror that will play for the next 3 centuries. The Vikings have announced themselves to Christian Europe with all the subtlety of a battle axe to the skull. And trust me, there's plenty more where that came from. The salt spray hits your face as you find yourself aboard a Viking longship 3 days before a raid. And wow, the smell alone could constitute a war crime. You're surrounded by warriors who've been marinating in their own sweat, seawater, and whatever that suspicious dried meat is for weeks. But beneath the stench, something electric crackles through the air. These men are transforming themselves into something that barely qualifies as human. The preparation for a raid isn't just about sharpening axes. It's about sharpening minds into weapons that would make modern psychological warfare experts take notes. You watch Ragnar. Let's call him Ragnar because every third Viking was named Ragnar, carefully braiding his beard with what appears to be dried blood. This isn't just questionable hygiene. It's part of an elaborate ritual designed to invoke Odin's blessing and, more importantly, scare the absolute hell out of anyone who sees him coming. The mainstream historical fact is that Vikings spent days psyching themselves up before raids through a combination of religious rituals, competitive boasting, and enough mead to kill a horse. They'd work themselves into what the sagas call berserkergang, literally going berserk. Though historians still argue whether this involved psychoactive mushrooms, extreme hyperventilation, or just really committed method acting. The berserker preparation happening at the ship's prow makes your modern gym pre-workout routine look like afternoon tea. You're watching a man named Bjorn literally bite his wooden shield while howling at clouds. His eyes have gone somewhere else entirely, pupils dilated, veins bulging, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth like a rabid dog that's been fed nothing but rage and fermented shark. The other Vikings give him a wide berth because, fun fact, berserkers in full frenzy couldn't always distinguish between friend and foe. Imagine being killed by your own teammate because he got too hyped up during warm-ups or like, here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some Vikings would perform what they called shield biting so vigorously that archaeologists have found shields with actual teeth marks deep enough to measure. One recovered shield from Denmark has bite marks that suggest its owner had absolutely magnificent dental work, which raises questions about Viking orthodontics that nobody really wants answered. These weren't just warriors. They were performance artists committed to their craft in ways that would make method actors weep with envy. The religious ceremonies are equally intense. You're watching the ship's crew sacrifice a horse. Sorry, horse lovers. But Sleipnir needs company in Valhalla, and everyone's painting themselves with blood in patterns that supposedly channel divine fury. The Gothi, priest, is chanting something that sounds like he's gargling gravel while constipated, invoking not just Odin, but the entire Norse pantheon's greatest hits. Thor for strength, Tyr for courage, and Loki for that special brand of chaotic energy that makes you think, attacking heavily armed strangers for their stuff, is a solid career choice, but the real psychological warfare starts with appearance. Vikings are stripping down to check their battle gear, and you realize these guys understood intimidation like modern sports psychologists understand performance anxiety. They're not just maintaining weapons, they're creating an image that will haunt English nightmares. Axes polished to mirror brightness, because nothing says hello, like seeing your own terrified reflection in the weapon about to split your skull. Helmets designed to make the wearer look inhuman, with face guards that turn men into metal demons. Despite what Hollywood told you, no horns, but the historical reality is actually scarier. These helmets often had spectacle-like eye guards that made the wearer look like some kind of ancient Terminator. The weapons prep is where things get genuinely disturbing. You watch Vikings naming their swords like beloved pets: Legbiter, Widowmaker, Brain Housing Group Reorganizer. Okay, I made that last one up, but you get the idea. They're running whetstones along edges already sharp enough to shave with, because apparently extremely lethal isn't lethal enough. One warrior is carefully wrapping his axe handle with fresh leather strips, explaining to his younger brother that sweaty hands have ruined more raids than English arrows. Professional attention to detail that would make serial killers take notes. The younger warriors are getting hazed in ways that make fraternity initiations look like gentle cuddle parties. You watch a barely bearded teen forced to drink a horn full of what I can only describe as liquid regret, some combination of mead, blood, and herbs that's supposed to grant berserker fury, but mostly seems to grant violent vomiting. The veterans laugh as he tries to keep it down, sharing stories of their first raids with the casual tone you'd use to discuss your first day at a new job. Except their job involves recreational dismemberment. The night before landing, things reach peak intensity. Warriors are dancing, if you can call aggressive stomping while waving axes dancing, around fires, working themselves into a frenzy that's part religious ecstasy, part group therapy, part pre-game warm-up. They're shouting boasts about how many Englishmen they'll kill, how much treasure they'll claim, how their names will live forever in songs. The psychological transformation is complete. These aren't farmers and fishermen anymore. They're instruments of divine violence, convinced that dying in battle is literally the best thing that could happen to them. Tomorrow, some poor English coastal village is about to meet men who've spent 3 days convincing themselves that they're invincible death machines blessed by gods who consider mercy a character flaw. Sweet dreams, everybody. You're standing on the pebbled beach at Portland in Dorset, 789 AD, watching history's deadliest case of mistaken identity unfold in real time. The local reeve, a well-meaning official named Bedewherd, is strutting down to the shore with the confidence of a man who has absolutely no idea he's about to become England's first named Viking casualty. 3 ships have just pulled up, and Bedewherd thinks they're merchants. He's even bringing his tax collection scrolls. Bless his bureaucratic heart. You want to scream at him that those aren't merchant vessels. Merchant ships don't usually feature crews doing synchronized axe-sharpening routines. But temporal tourism doesn't work that way. The Portland incident represents a fascinating historical moment because it shows just how unprepared England was for what was coming. The mainstream fact is that this was likely the first recorded Viking landing on English soil, predating even Lindisfarne, though it didn't get the same press because fewer monks survived to write angry letters about it. Bedewherd approaches the ships with 2 companions, probably already calculating customs duties in his head. The Vikings are watching him approach with expressions you might charitably describe as amused. Less charitably, they look like cats watching a mouse walk directly into their food bowl. Here's where things go sideways faster than a longship in a storm. Bidu Herd starts explaining, in that special tone reserved for dealing with foreign traders who clearly don't understand proper procedures, that they need to come with him to the royal manor at Dorchester. There's paperwork to fill out. You see, proper protocols to follow. The Vikings are nodding along, and you can practically see them thinking, this guy wants us to fill out forms. That's adorable. One of them is actually trying not to laugh, which in Viking culture is considered remarkably polite. The quirky, historical tidbit here is that archaeological evidence suggests the Vikings might have initially tried to play along. Coins found at the site indicate they had Danish trade goods with them, suggesting these might have been raiders doing a bit of legitimate commerce on the side. You know, diversifying their portfolio between pillaging and actual merchant work. It's like finding out your local burglar also runs a legitimate locksmith business. Historians still argue whether this was a planned reconnaissance mission disguised as trade, or just opportunistic Vikings who decided murder was easier than paperwork. You watch Bidu Herd's face as the lead Viking, let's call him Eric the easily annoyed, starts reaching for something. Wow. Bidu Herd probably thinks it's a money pouch. You know it's an axe. The Reeve is still mid-sentence about harbour fees when Nordic Steel introduces itself to his internal organs. The two companions don't even have time to process what's happening before they're joining their boss in an impromptu anatomy lesson. The efficiency is breathtaking, if you're into that sort of thing. 3 English officials down in less time than it takes to explain import duties. What happens next would be comedy if it weren't so tragic. The Vikings quickly strip the bodies, waste not, want not. And you notice one of them trying on Bidu Herd's official badge of office. He's prancing around making what are clearly mock official pronouncements in broken old English, while his mates laugh. You pay tax now, many tax. All your tax belong to us. I'm paraphrasing, but you get the energy. They're turning English bureaucracy into a comedy skit while Bidu Herd's blood is still warm on the beach. The real evidence of how naive the English were comes from what happens after. When the bodies are discovered, the local response isn't, "Oh God, foreign raiders, prepare defences." It's more like, "How dare these merchants murder our tax collector?" They genuinely think this is just a case of traders gone bad, like dealing with particularly aggressive door-to-door salesmen. Nobody considers that this might be the opening move in centuries of coordinated raids. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records it as simply as men from Norway causing a disturbance. A disturbance, like they knocked over some market stalls instead of inaugurating an age of terror. The Vikings, meanwhile, are already sailing away, probably still laughing about the whole thing. They've learned something valuable. The English coastal defences are about as effective as a chocolate teapot, and the locals are so used to peaceful trading that they'll walk right up to armed raiders carrying tax forms. It's like discovering your enemy's military strategy is hope everyone's friendly. The news will spread through Scandinavian waters faster than you can say sitting ducks, and every ambitious young Viking will start sharpening his axe and practicing his harmless merchant face. You're left standing on a beach with 3 cooling corpses and the dawning realization that England's just failed its first Viking encounter in the most spectacularly naive way possible. Bidu Herd's death won't even rate a proper memorial. He's just footnote fodder, the answer to a historical trivia question nobody wants to ask. But his spectacular misreading of the situation perfectly encapsulates how unprepared England was for what was coming. In 4 years, Lindisfarne will burn. In a generation, Viking armies will own half of England. And it all started here, with a tax collector who thought the appropriate response to mysterious foreign ships was paperwork. The Vikings are about to teach England that sometimes the only documentation you need is a sharp axe and a winning smile. And brother, they've got plenty of both. The holy island of Iona floats before you in the Scottish mist, like something from a fairy tale, which makes what's about to happen even more grotesque. You're witnessing the Viking Age's most persistent harassment campaign. Imagine if your neighborhood burglar kept coming back every few years just to make sure you hadn't acquired any new stuff worth stealing. Between 795 and 825, Vikings will hit this place 3 separate times, each raid more devastating than the last, like they're trying to unlock some kind of horrific achievement badge for monastery destruction. The first raid in 795 catches the monks so off guard they literally think it's the apocalypse. You're watching Brother Finian drop his illuminated manuscript, 2 years of work splashing into the mud, as dragon ships materialize from the morning fog. These monks have spent their entire lives on this remote island, creating the most beautiful books in Christendom, and now Vikings are about to use those same books as kindling. The irony is thick enough to choke on. Iona was founded by St. Columba specifically to be remote from worldly violence, and yet here comes worldly violence sailing up with a shopping list and zero chill. What makes Iona special, and therefore doomed, is its status as the Sacred Heart of Celtic Christianity. This isn't just any monastery, it's the Harvard, Oxford, and Vatican Library of the Celtic Church rolled into one. The mainstream historical fact is that Iona housed relics of St. Columba himself, plus a scriptorium that produced manuscripts so beautiful they made the Book of Kells look like a rush job. Vikings aren't stupid. They know quality merchandise when they see it. The first raid is almost tentative by Viking standards. They grab what they can carry, kill anyone too slow to run, and disappear before Scottish warriors can respond. Think of it as aggressive market research. But here's the quirky tidbit that historians love to argue about. Archaeological evidence suggests some Vikings might have tried to read the Latin text they stole, based on runic inscriptions found on recovered items that appear to be phonetic attempts at Latin prayers. Imagine some burly raider squinting at illuminated scripture by firelight, trying to sound out Pater Noster like he's in remedial Latin class. Pater Noster? This magic spell better be worth it. The cultural exchange happening here is bizarre. Murderous thieves accidentally getting religious education, while their victims get intensive lessons in Nordic blade work. You fast forward to 802, and the Vikings are back like a terrible sequel nobody asked for. This time, they've brought more ships and evidently spent the intervening years really thinking about maximizing their monastery raiding efficiency. The monks have rebuilt, restocked, and apparently learned nothing, because their defense strategy still consists mainly of prayer and running. You watch Vikings methodically working through the complex like they're following a checklist: chapel, looted, dormitory, ransacked. That new golden cross the monks just finished, already halfway to a longship. It's like watching the world's most violent inventory audit. The psychological trauma is almost worse than the physical destruction. These monks have spent 7 years convincing themselves the first raid was a one-time thing, God testing their faith or whatever helps them sleep at night. Now they're realizing they're basically living in a Viking drive-through restaurant. Some younger monks are having crisis of faith meltdowns in real time, wondering why God keeps letting heavily armed pagans use their life's work as toilet paper. The older monks just look tired, like retail workers dealing with yet another Black Friday riot. The third raid in 825 is where things get properly apocalyptic. By now, the Vikings treat Iona like their personal ATM, except this ATM dispenses golden crosses and occasionally bleeds. They're so confident they actually set up a temporary camp on the island, like tourists who've decided to extend their stay. You watch them systematically destroying what can't be carried, and I mean systematically. They're pulling down buildings stone by stone, ensuring the monks can't just rebuild again. This isn't raiding anymore. It's deliberate cultural vandalism with extreme prejudice. Historians still argue whether the repeated raids on Iona were strategically planned or just Vikings returning to a reliable source of loot like salmon to spawning grounds. The evidence suggests a bit of both. Viking leaders definitely knew Iona's importance to Scottish Christianity, but they also knew monks had this adorable habit of rebuilding and restocking with fresh treasures. It's like robbing someone who compulsively redecorates with expensive stuff. Eventually, you just add them to your regular circuit. The final death toll across all 3 raids is staggering. We're talking about dozens of monks killed, centuries of accumulated knowledge destroyed, and irreplaceable manuscripts turned into Viking fire starters. One chronicle mentions 68 monks killed in a single incident at Martyrs Bay, which got its name for exactly the reason you think. The survivors eventually give up and relocate the monastery's treasures to Kells in Ireland, which is like admitting defeat, but with extra steps. Iona will never recover its former glory, reduced from Christianity's shining beacon to a recurring victim in the Viking crime blotter. The message is clear. Nowhere is safe. Sanctity is negotiable. And God apparently has really flexible office hours when it comes to protecting his servants from Nordic customer service. You're standing on the Thames riverbank in 1009, watching the most audacious Viking engineering project since some mad genius invented the longship. Thorkel the High, a Viking leader whose nickname seriously undersells his ambitions, has decided that London Bridge isn't just an obstacle to be avoided, but a challenge to be literally pulled down. Yes, you heard that right. While most military commanders would go around or over a bridge, Thorkel's looking at it like a drunk person eyeing a Jenga tower. Except the stakes are considerably higher and involve significantly more drowning. The mainstream historical fact here is that Vikings besieged London multiple times between 1009 and 1016, with various sources describing attacks on London Bridge itself. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle gets uncharacteristically excited describing these events, like even the monks writing it couldn't believe what they were documenting. But the real showstopper comes in 1014, when Vikings allegedly tied ropes to the bridge's support posts and used their ships to pull it down. This is where the nursery rhyme "London Bridge is falling down" supposedly comes from, though historians still argue whether it's based on this event or just medieval infrastructure's general tendency to collapse. You watch as Viking ships approach the bridge with what can only be described as malicious intent. The English defenders on the bridge are shooting arrows and dropping stones, which would be effective if the Vikings hadn't thought ahead. They've covered their ships with what looks like wet animal hides and rough wooden roofing, essentially turning their longships into armoured battering rams that smell like a barn fire. It's ugly, it's crude, and it's absolutely brilliant. The defenders' arrows bounce off like aggressive rain, while Vikings underneath are attaching massive ropes to the bridge supports. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Archaeological evidence from the Thames suggests Vikings might have used a technique similar to how they launched ships, but in reverse. Instead of rolling boats into water, they're using their boats to roll a bridge out of existence. One recovered timber from this period shows rope wear patterns consistent with massive lateral stress, suggesting someone really did try to turn London Bridge into London pile of wet planks. The engineering involved is actually impressive. These aren't just raiders anymore. They're demolition experts with a naval twist. The actual pulling begins, and it's both ridiculous and terrifying. You've got dozens of Viking ships rowing in coordination, turning the Thames into the world's worst synchronized swimming event. The bridge starts groaning, a sound that makes everyone's teeth hurt, while defenders realize they're not just fighting Vikings, but also physics. And physics picked a side. English soldiers are trying to cut the ropes while simultaneously not falling into the river, which is a bit like trying to change a tire while the car's still moving. The Vikings below are singing what sounds like a work song, but is probably "Heave ho, London's got to go" in Old Norse. King Ethelred, yes, that's Ethelred the Unready, whose nickname becomes more appropriate by the minute, is supposedly watching from the shore, probably wondering if his royal advisors are taking applications. His defense strategy for London has just been defeated by the maritime equivalent of a tractor pull. The Vikings have turned his city's main defensive feature into a liability, which is like watching someone use your own security system to rob you. The psychological impact is almost worse than the physical destruction. If Vikings can pull down London Bridge, what can't they do? The bridge doesn't collapse dramatically all at once. This isn't Hollywood. Instead, it fails in stages, like a very wet, very deadly game of dominoes. First, a support post shifts. Then planking starts separating. Then defenders realize they're standing on medieval engineering that's rapidly transitioning from bridge to swimming lesson. The screaming is audible over the groaning wood and rushing water. Some soldiers jump, others fall, and a few optimists try to run for either end. The Thames, always hungry, swallows them all with equal enthusiasm. Meanwhile, Thorkel's men are celebrating like they've just invented a new sport, extreme bridge demolition, Viking edition. They're actually taking pieces of the bridge as souvenirs, because nothing says I helped destroy London's defences like a chunk of waterlogged English timber. Some enterprising Viking is already composing a saga about it, probably calling it How Thorkel Made London Wet, or something equally subtle. The tactical advantage is immediate. With the bridge down, Vikings can sail up and down the Thames like they own it, which, functionally, they now do. The aftermath is even more demoralizing for the English. London Bridge wasn't just infrastructure. It was a symbol of royal power and commercial prosperity. Now it's driftwood and Viking conversation pieces. The city split in two. Communication between the banks becomes a logistical nightmare, and everyone's morale is somewhere between defeated and actively drowning. Historians still argue whether the bridge pulling actually happened or was exaggerated by saga writers who never met an exploit they couldn't embellish. But archaeological evidence of hasty bridge repairs and replacement from this exact period suggests something catastrophic definitely happened to London Bridge, and Vikings with ropes and a can-do attitude remain the most likely culprits. The lesson is clear. When Vikings show up with rope and rowing coordination, maybe just evacuate the bridge preemptively. You're standing in Greenwich on April 19th, 1012, watching what happens when Viking drinking games go catastrophically wrong. Archbishop Elfia, Canterbury's top religious authority, and a man who clearly didn't read the How to Survive Viking Captivity handbook, is about to discover that refusing to let people ransom you is a spectacular way to end up as history's most unusual martyr. The Vikings have been holding him for 7 months, and their patience has run out faster than their mead supply, which is really saying something considering how much these guys can drink. The backstory here is almost as insane as what's about to happen. Elfia was captured during a Viking raid on Canterbury, where they basically treated the holy city like a clearance sale with violence. The mainstream historical fact is that Vikings demanded £48,000 of silver for his release, an absolutely astronomical sum that would have bankrupted several kingdoms. But Elfia, in a move that's either supremely principled or supremely stupid, forbade anyone from paying his ransom. He didn't want to burden his already impoverished people with more taxes. Noble? Yes. Smart when you're being held by people who consider aggressive negotiation a form of entertainment. That's debatable. The Viking camp at Greenwich is basically Coachella, if Coachella involved more axes and fewer flower crowns. They've been feasting for days, celebrating their successful extortion of everywhere else in England. You can smell the party from half a mile away, roasting meat, spilled ale, and that special aroma of several hundred unwashed warriors who think bathing is what you do accidentally when you fall off your ship. Elfia is tied to a post in the middle of all this, still refusing to authorize his own ransom like the world's most stubborn hostage. Here's your quirky, historical tidbit. The weapon that finally kills Elfia isn't a sword or an axe. It's ox bones from the feast. Yes, you read that right. The Vikings get so drunk and angry at his refusal to be ransomed that they start pelting him with dinner leftovers. Archaeological evidence from Greenwich includes unusual concentrations of cattle bones from this period, some showing impact damage consistent with being thrown really, really hard. It's like being stoned to death, except the stones are what's left of your captor's dinner. There's something uniquely Viking about turning meal waste into murder weapons. The scene starts almost playfully. If you can call anything involving Vikings and captives playful, they're drunk, not regular drunk, but Viking feast drunk, which is like normal drunk multiplied by testosterone and poor impulse control. Someone throws a bone at Elfia, probably aiming for humiliation rather than harm. It hits. Others laugh. Then more bones fly. It's like the world's deadliest food fight, except only one person's getting hit and he's tied up. The Archbishop is praying throughout this, which seems to annoy the Vikings even more. Nothing ruins a good drunken murder quite like your victim maintaining moral superiority. Thorkel the High, remember him from the London Bridge incident, is actually trying to stop this. He's offering money from his own share to save Elfia, not from any Christian sympathy, but because he recognizes the political value of a live archbishop versus a dead one. But drunk Vikings are like a force of nature, except nature usually has better aim. They're beyond reasoning, beyond threats, beyond anything except the primal urge to throw things at the annoying priest who won't let them get rich. The historical accounts get graphic here. Elfia is struck repeatedly, head, body, limbs, while maintaining what witnesses describe as an eerie calm. He's still praying, still refusing to authorize payment, still being frustratingly holy while covered in blood and beef remnants. The Vikings are getting angrier with each throw, because how dare this prisoner maintain dignity while they're literally garbage murdering him? It's messing with the whole power dynamic. You're supposed to beg when Vikings hurt you. It's like page 1 of the victim handbook. Finally, someone. The sagas say it was a Viking named Thrum, which sounds like a noise you make while vomiting, decides bones aren't efficient enough and brings an axe to the food fight. One merciful or just impatient blow ends what the chronicles describe as hours of torture. Elfia dies, and even the Vikings seem momentarily stunned by what they've done. They've killed plenty of people, sure, but murdering an archbishop with dinner scraps while he prayed for your souls, that's new. even for them. The aftermath is surprisingly tense. Some Vikings are worried about divine retribution. They're pagan, sure, but they're not stupid enough to discount the possibility that the Christian God might take issue with them turning his top UK representative into a human piñata. Others are just annoyed that they've lost potential ransom money. Thorkel is furious enough to switch sides entirely, later joining the English with 45 ships. Turns out even Vikings have limits, and drunkenly pelting holy men with ox bones is apparently where Thorkel draws his line. The English eventually recover Elfhere's body and declare him a martyr, which is nice, but probably not much comfort to someone who died being stoned with barbecue leftovers. History remembers him as Saint Elfhere, patron saint of, well, presumably of people who refuse to negotiate with terrorists, even when those terrorists are very drunk and have access to large bones. You're trudging through the muddy streets of York, or Jorvik, as your new Viking overlords insist on calling it, in 867, watching a city transform from English commercial hub to Nordic murder capital in real time. The great heathen army has just taken the city, and great doesn't refer to their moral character. This isn't your typical Viking raid where they grab the silverware and sail home. No, these bastards brought moving vans. They're here to stay, and they're redecorating with extreme prejudice. The mainstream historical fact is that the great heathen army, led by the wonderfully named Ivar the Boneless, and yes, historians still argue about what exactly was boneless, captured York on November the 1st, 866. They exploited a civil war between two rival Northumbrian kings, both named Ella and Osbert, because apparently medieval England couldn't even have a civil war without making it confusing. The Vikings basically walked into a city where the defenders were too busy fighting each other to notice the actual invaders until axes started redistributing their internal organs. You're watching Vikings systematically convert York from a Christian trading centre into their primary military base in England. They're not subtle about it. That church over there? It's now a weapons storage facility. The monastery. Congratulations. It's been rezoned as warrior housing. The Christian cemetery? Well, let's just say it's about to get a lot more crowded, and the new arrivals won't be getting Christian burials. It's urban planning with a decidedly homicidal twist. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Archaeological digs in modern York have found evidence that Vikings actually improved the city's infrastructure while simultaneously terrorizing its population. They installed better drainage systems, expanded the dock facilities, and established organized craft districts. It's like being conquered by murderous civil engineers. One layer of excavation shows Christian artifacts. The next shows Viking weapons and pagan amulets. And sometimes they're mixed together in ways suggesting Vikings were literally building their new city on the corpses of the old inhabitants. The great heathen army isn't your typical Viking raiding party. These aren't farmers supplementing their income with seasonal pillaging. This is a professional military force, possibly numbering in the thousands, with a command structure, logistics network, and long-term strategic goals. You watch them setting up forges, establishing supply lines, and creating what military historians would recognize as a forward operating base. If regular Viking raids were terrorist attacks, this is a full-scale invasion and occupation. The transformation of York is brutal but fascinating. Vikings are pragmatists. They keep what works and replace what doesn't, with maximum efficiency and minimal concern for previous owners' feelings. The Roman walls still standing. Those stay. but now they're topped with Viking warriors who've clearly been practicing their menacing silhouette poses. The market squares continue functioning, except now the merchants are paying taxes to guys named Sigurd instead of guys named Ethelred. The main difference is that Sigurd's tax collectors carry bigger axes and have fewer qualms about aggressive auditing. King Ella, one of those two kings who was too busy with civil war to defend properly, gets special treatment. The sagas claim Ivar the Boneless had him executed via blood eagle, which, if you don't know, involves separating ribs from the spine and pulling out the lungs to create wings. It's either the most metal thing ever, or saga writers getting creative with their descriptions. Historians still argue whether this actually happened, or was just Viking psychological warfare retroactively made literal. Either way, the message to remaining English nobility is clear. Resist and become involuntary anatomy lessons. The religious transformation is particularly stark. You're watching Vikings convert churches into feasting halls, using altar stones as butcher blocks, and generally treating Christian sacred spaces with the reverence you'd show a public restroom. But here's the weird part. They're not destroying everything. Some Vikings are actually interested in the books and metalwork, not for their religious value, but for their craftsmanship. It's cultural appreciation filtered through a lens of violence and theft. Within months, York starts looking like a proper Viking city. The sound of Old Norse begins drowning out English in the streets. Norse coins start circulating alongside English ones. Viking merchants arrive, setting up shops selling everything from walrus ivory to slave chains. The transformation is so complete that when English forces try to retake the city in 867, they barely recognize it. The Vikings have installed better defenses, created kill zones that would make modern urban warfare specialists nod approvingly, and generally turned York into a fortress that screams "Come at me, bro" in Old Norse. The locals who survive, and surprisingly many do, face a choice: adapt or die. Some English residents start adopting Norse customs, names, and hairstyles. Vikings are very particular about their hair, apparently. Others maintain their English identity, but learn enough Norse to navigate their new reality. It's cultural assimilation at sword point, creating a hybrid Anglo-Norse society that will reshape northern England for centuries. York becomes Jorvik, and Jorvik becomes the beating heart of Viking England, pumping out raiding parties like a cardiovascular system designed by war criminals. The great heathen army hasn't just captured a city, they've created a beachhead for the Viking transformation of England. And trust me, they're just getting started. You're creeping through the darkened halls of Jarrow Monastery at 3 a.m., following a Viking raiding party that's treating this house of God like a Black Friday sale where everything must go and violence is encouraged. The precision with which they're systematically looting this place would be admirable if it weren't so horrifying. These aren't random barbarians smashing things for fun, though they're definitely having fun. These are professional ecclesiastical asset liquidators who've turned monastery raiding into a science. The mainstream historical fact is that Vikings targeted monasteries for brutally practical reasons. They were wealthy, poorly defended, and conveniently located on coasts or rivers. Monks had this adorable habit of collecting all their community's wealth in one convenient location, decorating it with gold and jewels, then defending it with nothing but prayers and positive thinking. From a Viking perspective, it's like finding a mall with no security guards where everything's made of precious metals. The fact that these were holy sites actually made them better targets. Christians wouldn't dare hide their wealth in churches, would they? Spoiler, they absolutely would. and Vikings knew it. You watch as the lead Viking, let's call him Olaf the Methodical, directs his men with the efficiency of a seasoned heist coordinator. 2 men to the altar, checking for hidden compartments. 3 to the scriptorium, evaluating manuscripts for their binding value. 1 guy specifically assigned to tap walls listening for hollow sounds. They've done this so many times they have specialized roles. There's even a Viking whose entire job seems to be guy who knows which candlesticks are silver-plated versus solid silver. That's career specialization you won't find in any medieval job fair. Here's your quirky, historical tidbit. Vikings became so efficient at finding hidden monastery treasures that monks started getting creative with their hiding spots. Archaeological evidence shows false floors, hidden chambers in walls, and even precious items stuffed inside altar statues. One recovered gospel book shows evidence of having its jeweled cover hastily removed and replaced with plain leather. Monks literally downgrading their bling to save it. But Vikings caught onto this too, which is why you're watching one raider carefully feeling book covers for suspiciously new stitching. It's an arms race between holy hoarders and sacred space thieves. The systematic approach is genuinely impressive. They start with the obvious: golden crosses, silver chalices, anything shiny that isn't nailed down. And plenty that is, once they locate their crowbars. But then they move to less obvious targets. Embroidered vestments. Those threads might be gold. Illuminated manuscripts. The covers are valuable. And vellum can be scraped clean and resold. Even the lead from the windows gets pried out. Metal is metal. And Vikings don't discriminate. One raider is currently stuffing altar cloths into a sack, probably figuring his wife back home would appreciate some fancy table linens, even if they do have suspicious wine stains shaped like crosses. The monks of Jarrow are huddled in the dormitory, listening to their life's work being efficiently disassembled. Brother Aldwin spent 3 years illuminating that psalter, currently being evaluated for its resale value. Brother Cuthbert's prized collection of saints' relics is being dumped out so Vikings can keep the fancy containers. The emotional violence is almost worse than the physical. Those several monks who tried to protect the altar are discovering that Vikings don't really distinguish between the two. What's fascinating is the Viking knowledge of Christian practices. They know exactly when morning prayers happen, so they attack at night. They understand that certain items are holier and therefore more valuable than others. You watch one Viking carefully wrapping what's obviously a saint's relic, not from reverence but because he knows intact relics sell better than loose bones. Another is arguing with his companion about whether a particular manuscript is worth taking, showing a disturbing familiarity with Latin letter forms. These aren't ignorant pagans. They're informed consumers who've done their market research. The intelligence network behind these raids is something historians still argue about. How did Vikings know which monasteries had the best loot? Some theories involve Christian slaves providing information. Others suggest Viking traders doing reconnaissance during legitimate business. Watching this raid, you're convinced someone drew them a floor plan. They're moving through Jarrow like they've got a guided tour, hitting all the highlights with minimal wandering. The prior's private chamber, theoretically secret, gets visited within the first 10 minutes. The violence, when it comes, is weirdly professional. Monks who don't resist are mostly shoved aside. Those who try to protect treasures get efficiently murdered, but without the recreational sadism you might expect. It's not that Vikings are showing mercy. They just recognize that time spent torturing monks is time not spent loading boats with treasure. One young monk makes the mistake of trying to hide a golden crucifix under his robes, The Viking who catches him looks almost disappointed at having to kill someone so bad at crime. The axe blow is quick, clean, and accompanied by what sounds like a tutorial. Other Vikings are clearly using this as a teaching moment for the younger raiders about why you always check the suspicious lumpy monks. By dawn, Jarrow looks like it's been processed by the world's most violent recycling centre. Anything metal is gone. Anything decorated is stolen. Anything valuable enough to justify boat space is halfway to Scandinavia. The Vikings leave behind confused monks, empty shelves, and the architectural equivalent of a picked clean carcass. They've even taken the bronze bell, which means the monks can't even call each other to prayer to commiserate about their losses. It's the kind of thorough that makes you realize Vikings didn't just raid monasteries. They perfected it, turned it into an art form where the canvas is trauma and the paint is other people's life savings. You're standing in the royal treasury at Winchester in 991, watching King Ethelred count out silver coins with the enthusiasm of someone paying their own ransom, which, essentially, he is. The pile of silver growing on the counting table represents England's new foreign policy. Please don't hurt us, here's money. This payment of £10,000 of silver is the first official Dangeld, though it won't be the last. Oh no, this is just the opening bid in what will become history's most expensive protection racket, where the protection is, we promise not to murder you as much, maybe. The mainstream historical fact is that Dangeld payments eventually totaled over £200,000 of silver, an absolutely staggering amount that drained England's economy like a vampire with expensive tastes. To put this in perspective, a skilled craftsman might earn £1 of silver per year. England is essentially paying 200,000 annual salaries to Vikings for the privilege of not being constantly murdered. It's taxation without representation. Except the representatives are carrying axes and have names like Eric Bloodaxe, which admittedly would make C-SPAN more interesting. The psychology behind Dangeld is fascinatingly stupid. Ethelred, whose nickname, the Unready, actually means poorly advised, though the Unready works too, genuinely believes he can buy peace. You watch his advisors nodding along, probably thinking, sure, let's give violent extortionists massive amounts of money. What could possibly go wrong? The Vikings, meanwhile, are trying not to laugh. From their perspective, England just announced it's willing to pay not to be raided. It's like putting up a sign saying, we'll pay you to not rob us, then wondering why robbers keep showing up. Here's your quirky, historical tidbit. Archaeological evidence shows Danegeld silver ended up everywhere from Iceland to Russia, essentially funding the entire Viking economy. English coins from this period have been found in Swedish hoards, Norwegian graves, and Danish market sites. England is inadvertently sponsoring Viking expansion, like a medieval venture capitalist who doesn't realize they're investing in their own destruction. Some Viking coins were even melted down and recast into jewelry, meaning somewhere a Viking wife was wearing English economic desperation as a necklace. The collection process for Dangeld is almost as brutal as the raids it's supposed to prevent. You're watching tax collectors spread across England, extracting silver from people who barely survived the last Viking visit. Peasants are selling livestock, merchants are liquidating inventory, and churches are melting down sacred vessels. The irony is thick enough to choke on. England is destroying its own wealth to prevent Vikings from destroying its wealth. It's economic suicide with extra steps, and everyone except Ethelred seems to realize it. The Vikings have turned Danegeld into a business model. Why raid when you can just threaten to raid? They're essentially running a subscription service where the product is not murdering you, and the premium tier includes, "We'll murder your enemies instead." Some Viking leaders are actually offering to protect England from other Vikings, which is like the arsonist offering to sell you fire insurance. The price keeps going up because why wouldn't it? England has proven they'll pay, and Vikings aren't known for their reasonable pricing strategies. The silver counting continues, and you notice something disturbing. Vikings are present during the payment, supervising to ensure they get every penny. They're wandering around Winchester like they own the place, which financially speaking, they kind of do. English nobles have to smile and be polite to the people extorting them, which adds insult to financial injury. One Viking is actually giving unsolicited advice about English monetary policy, suggesting they could afford higher payments if they managed their economy better. The audacity is almost admirable. Historians still argue whether Danegeld was ever effective. Sure, sometimes Vikings took the money and left, temporarily. But paying Danegeld was like feeding stray cats. It doesn't make them go away. It just ensures they'll come back hungrier. Each payment proved England could afford to pay, encouraging bigger demands. The £10,000 paid in 991 became 16,000 in 994, then 24,000 in 1002, then 36,000 in 1007. It's inflation driven by axes rather than economic forces. The real damage wasn't just financial. Danegeld destroyed English morale faster than actual raids. You're watching a kingdom admit it can't defend itself, publicly announcing its weakness with every silver penny. The Vikings don't even need to raid anymore. They've won psychologically. England is paying them to maybe possibly consider not attacking. Perhaps, if they feel like it. The protection being bought is theoretical, while the silver being paid is extremely real. The payment ceremony ends with forced smiles and insincere promises. Vikings swear they'll leave England in peace, using the same tone you'd use promising to call someone after a bad date. English officials pretend to believe them, because what's the alternative? Admitting you just bankrupted your kingdom for nothing? The silver is loaded onto carts, heading for Viking ships, where it will be divided among warriors who are already planning their next visit. Because why kill the cow when it's volunteering to be milked? Danegeld hasn't bought peace. It's bought England a subscription to its own exploitation. And the Vikings are about to hit them with some seriously aggressive upselling. You're packed into the hold of a Viking longship somewhere in the North Sea, surrounded by human cargo that includes what's left of Lindisfarne's novice monks, several women from Northumbrian villages, and one extremely confused nobleman who keeps insisting there's been a terrible mistake. The smell would be enough to make you retch if you weren't already seasick from the boat's constant rolling. Welcome to the Viking slave trade, where the merchandise has opinions and the customer service is exactly as horrible as you'd expect. The mainstream historical fact is that slaves, or thralls in Old Norse, were Viking society's second most valuable trade commodity after silver. Conservative estimates suggest Vikings enslaved tens of thousands of people from the British Isles alone. Dublin became Western Europe's largest slave market, a distinction nobody puts on tourist brochures. These weren't just raids for treasure. They were organized human trafficking operations that would make modern criminals take notes. If modern criminals were interested in historical precedent for being absolute bastards. The selection process during raids was brutally practical. You watched it happen at the last monastery. Vikings evaluating humans like livestock at market, young, strong, and skilled. You're coming with us, old, sick, or annoying. Here's an axe to the skull. Children were particularly valuable because they could be trained and were easier to transport. That 12-year-old altar boy currently crying in the corner, he'll fetch good silver in Dublin's market. His ability to read and write Latin makes him premium merchandise. Viking Jarls love literate slaves for record keeping, because apparently even Dark Age warlords need accountants. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Archaeological DNA evidence from Iceland shows that while most male settlers were Norse, a significant percentage of female settlers were Celtic, specifically from Ireland and Scotland. These weren't willing immigrants. Vikings were literally stealing women from the British Isles to populate their new colonies. Iceland's founding population was essentially Norse men and kidnapped Celtic women, which explains a lot about Icelandic sagas' preoccupation with complicated family dynamics and revenge cycles. The conditions in this slave ship are teaching you new definitions of misery. Slaves are packed together with less space than Viking cargo usually gets. After all, barrels of mead don't need to breathe as much. The youngest captives are kept near the center, where they're less likely to jump overboard, because Vikings have learned that desperate children make poor swimmers. Food is minimal, stale bread and water, occasionally supplemented with whatever the Vikings don't want. One woman hasn't stopped praying since capture, her voice hoarse but persistent. The Vikings find this amusing rather than annoying, taking bets on when she'll give up. The journey to slave markets is strategically planned. Vikings know exactly where to sell different types of slaves for maximum profit. Skilled craftsmen go to established Viking towns where their abilities are valued. Young women often end up in Viking households as ambat, a term that covers everything from domestic servant to involuntary concubine. The strongest men might be sold to other Vikings as farm laborers, though some end up rowing the same type of ship that captured them, which is irony so dark it could eclipse the sun. You notice Vikings treating certain slaves differently, not better, just differently. The nobleman who keeps insisting on his importance is being kept relatively intact, probably for ransom rather than sale. A young monk who demonstrated medical knowledge is getting slightly better food, his value as a healer recognized. But the teenage girl who tried to escape during loading, she's sporting bruises that serve as both punishment and warning to others. Vikings are practical about their cruelty, applying exactly as much violence as needed to maintain control and maximize profit. The slave trade's economic impact on Viking society was massive. You're watching the foundation of an entire economy built on human misery. These slaves will build Viking towns, work Viking farms, and service Viking households. Some will earn freedom after years of labor, integrating into Norse society. Others will die in bondage, their names forgotten, their stories reduced to archaeological evidence, Celtic jewelry in Norse graves, English names in Icelandic genealogies, Christian artifacts in pagan contexts. Historians still argue about exact numbers, but conservative estimates suggest Vikings enslaved at least 10% of England's population over the Viking Age. That's hundreds of thousands of people ripped from their homes, separated from families, and sold like cattle. The cultural trauma echoes through centuries. English laws from this period obsessively detail penalties for slave taking, suggesting it was common enough to need extensive legislation. Irish chronicles describe entire regions depopulated by Viking slavers, creating social wounds that took generations to heal. The ship is approaching Dublin now, and the slaves are being prepared for market. Vikings are sorting them into groups, cleaning the most valuable ones, can't sell premium merchandise looking shabby. The young monk is practicing his Latin, probably hoping literacy will get him a less horrible owner. The women are having their hair combed, beauty being unfortunately marketable, even in slavery. Hierarchies emerge. House slaves look down on field slaves. Skilled slaves distance themselves from unskilled. It's human nature's darkest comedy, maintaining social structures even in chains. You're about to witness Dublin's slave market in full swing, where humans are commodities and Vikings have cornered the market on monetizing misery. The fact that some of these slaves will eventually integrate into Viking society, their descendants becoming full Norse citizens, doesn't make the horror of their capture any less real. History's complexity doesn't excuse its cruelties. You're pressed against the stone walls of Exeter in 876, watching Vikings deploy their hottest new siege technology, literally. The Danish army has surrounded the city, and they're not just using conventional weapons. Those aren't normal arrows flying over the walls. They're flaming projectiles turning the thatched roofs of Exeter into a citywide barbecue. But the real innovation is down at the river, where Vikings have converted their longships into floating fire delivery systems that would make modern arsonists weep with envy. The mainstream historical fact is that Vikings besieged Exeter multiple times during the 870s, with the 876 siege being particularly brutal. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes how the Danish army, led by Guthrum, who clearly didn't get the memo about not playing with fire, used both land and naval forces to surround the city. But chronicles tend to skimp on the gory details, like how Viking fire ships turned the River Exe into a medieval hellscape that made normal siege warfare look like a polite disagreement. You watch Vikings preparing their fire ships with the methodical precision of people who've turned arson into an art form. They're coating entire vessels with pitch and tar, stuffing them with anything flammable, straw, dried wood, probably a few unfortunate English manuscripts they've been saving for just such an occasion. The smell alone is enough to make your eyes water from across the river. These aren't crude torches. They're carefully engineered incendiary devices designed to create maximum psychological and physical damage. Here's your quirky, historical tidbit. Archaeological evidence from Exeter shows unusual burn patterns on Roman-era stones that were reused in Saxon fortifications. The heat was so intense it actually changed the molecular structure of the stones, creating what geologists call thermal shock fractures. In layman's terms, Vikings made fire so hot it literally cracked rocks. Some stones show evidence of multiple heating and cooling cycles, suggesting Vikings didn't just use fire once. They turned sections of Exeter's walls into repeated science experiments in thermal dynamics. King Alfred is supposedly directing the defense, though directing might be generous. It's more like he's watching his city burn while trying to figure out which disaster to address first. The fire arrows are bad enough, but the fire ships are next-level psychological warfare. You watch one Viking ship, fully ablaze and crewed by absolute madmen who wait until the last possible second to jump overboard, crash into Exeter's wooden river defences. The explosion of sparks and flames is visible throughout the city, and the screaming, both from defenders trying to put out fires and Vikings celebrating their pyrotechnic success, creates a soundtrack from hell. The Danish strategy is brilliant in its simplicity. Why waste Viking lives on direct assault when you can just burn the defenders out? Every fire that starts inside Exeter means fewer defenders on the walls as bucket brigades form. You're watching medieval multitasking at its worst. Soldiers trying to fight off Vikings while simultaneously preventing their own city from becoming charcoal. One poor soul is attempting to loose arrows at attackers while his own cloak is smouldering. The Vikings find this hilarious, which really adds insult to third-degree burns. Inside Exeter, panic is spreading faster than the fires. The city's wooden buildings are basically kindling with doors, and the narrow streets turn firefighting into a logistical nightmare. You watch families forming human chains to pass water buckets, but it's like trying to put out a forest fire with a water pistol. The wealthy are trying to save their possessions. The poor are trying to save their lives, and everyone's failing at both. One merchant is actually negotiating with his neighbors about whose house to sacrifice as a firebreak, because capitalism doesn't take sick days even during Viking sieges. The Vikings, meanwhile, are treating this like a spectator sport. They've set up camps just out of arrow range where they can watch Exeter burn while enjoying their evening meal. Some are taking bets on which section of wall will collapse first. Others are preparing the next wave of fire ships, because why stop at partial destruction when complete annihilation is on the menu? The efficiency is terrifying. They've turned siege warfare into a production line where the product is thermal trauma. Historians still argue whether Alfred managed to negotiate a settlement or if the Vikings just got bored of watching Exeter burn. The evidence suggests a bit of both. Burn patterns indicate the fires were controlled rather than total, suggesting someone called a halt before complete destruction. But the psychological damage was done. Exeter's population learned that stone walls meant nothing when Vikings could turn your entire city into a furnace. The burnt sections took years to rebuild, and archaeological digs still find layers of ash and charred timber from this period, like geological strata marking that time Vikings nearly deleted our city. The siege ends with Exeter paying tribute, and Vikings agreeing to maybe not burn everything next time. You watch defenders emerge from smoking ruins, covered in soot and defeat, while Vikings load their payment onto ships still reeking of pitch. The fireship technology will spread throughout Viking fleets, because nothing says effective negotiation tactic like threatening to turn your enemy's home into the world's largest campfire. Exeter survives, barely, but the message is clear. Vikings don't just bring death by blade anymore. They've graduated to death by chemistry, and their final exam is your city walls. You're standing in a forest clearing in East Anglia on November 20th, 869, watching what happens when Vikings decide to get creative with their religious intolerance. King Edmund, soon to be Saint Edmund, though he doesn't know it yet, is tied to an oak tree. And the Danish Great Army is about to demonstrate why martyrdom and Viking creativity should never appear in the same sentence. This isn't just an execution. It's a theological statement written in arrows and blood, directed by Ivar the Boneless, who apparently considers subtle messaging a character flaw. The mainstream historical fact is that Edmund, the last independent king of East Anglia, was killed by Vikings after refusing to renounce Christianity or become a puppet ruler under Danish control. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle gets uncharacteristically emotional describing his death, which tells you something went seriously wrong here. But the Chronicle's version is practically PG-13 compared to what later hagiographies describe. A death so elaborately cruel, it makes regular Viking violence look like constructive criticism. Edmund's tied to that tree in a position deliberately mimicking Christ's crucifixion, because Vikings understand symbolism when it suits their purposes. You watch Danish archers forming up, and this isn't going to be a quick execution. No, Ivar has decided Edmund should become a human pincushion, recreating the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian, but with worse aim and more enthusiasm. The first arrow thuds into Edmund's shoulder, He gasps, but starts praying louder, which seems to irritate the Vikings more than any physical resistance would have. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Later medieval paintings of Edmund's martyrdom show him absolutely bristling with arrows, like a holy hedgehog. But archaeological evidence suggests the reality was even weirder. Arrow points found at suspected martyrdom sites show unusual wear patterns consistent with being shot from very close range into something that didn't move, like, say, a tied-up king. Some arrowheads show impact damage suggesting they hit other arrows already in the target. The Vikings were literally playing human dartboard, trying to fit as many arrows as possible into one increasingly perforated monarch. The religious element makes this execution special in the worst possible way. Vikings are pagans, sure, but they're usually pragmatic about it. Kill the Christian king, take his stuff, maybe install a puppet ruler, standard operating procedure. But Edmund had to go and make it religious, refusing to deny Christ or pay tribute to heathen dogs. Now Ivar's making an example that says, this is what happens when you prioritize your imaginary friend over practical politics. Each arrow is a theological argument with a very sharp point. You notice younger Vikings in the crowd looking uncomfortable. Murder they're fine with. But this theatrical sadism feels different. One actually turns away when an arrow catches Edmund in the throat, producing sounds no human should make while still technically alive. But the veterans are watching with professional interest, probably taking notes for future religious executions. Remember, Bjorn, when killing Christian kings, pace your arrows for maximum suffering. You want them alive enough to regret their life choices. The psychological warfare extends beyond Edmund. Every Christian in East Anglia will hear about this. How their king died calling on Christ while Vikings turned him into the world's holiest archery target. The message is clear. Your God won't save you. Your prayers are just noise, and we have so many arrows. Some witnesses later claim Edmund's faith never wavered, that he kept praying until physically unable. Others suggest the prayers turned into screaming pretty quickly. Vikings don't care either way. The visual is what matters. But here's where it gets properly weird. After Edmund finally dies, and it takes a while, Vikings are thorough. They cut off his head and, according to legend, throw it into the forest. Why? Because apparently shooting someone full of arrows isn't quite enough desecration. Later stories claim Edmund's head was found being guarded by a wolf, calling out, "Here, here," to searchers in Latin. Historians still argue whether this was medieval myth-making or Vikings actually training wildlife for post-execution pranks. Honestly, with Vikings, either seems possible. The aftermath turns Edmund into East Anglia's most popular saint, faster than you can say martyrdom marketing. His death becomes the ultimate Viking atrocity story, told and retold with increasing embellishments. The arrow count grows with each telling. New tortures get added. Some versions have Vikings practicing blood eagle on him first. Because why have one horrific execution method when you can have two? Churches across England start depicting Edmund looking like he fought a porcupine and lost. The Vikings, meanwhile, are puzzled by the Christian response. They killed Edmund to demonstrate powerlessness, but Christians turned it into a victory narrative. It's like winning a fight, but losing the propaganda war. Ivar probably didn't expect Edmund to become more powerful dead than alive, his shrine attracting pilgrims and, more importantly, donations for future anti-Viking activities. The execution that was supposed to demoralize Christian resistance ends up funding it. You're left standing in a clearing full of Danish warriors congratulating themselves on a job well done. not realizing they've just created a saint whose cult will outlast their great army by centuries. Edmund's blood is soaking into English soil, but it's his story that'll prove immortal. The Vikings have won the battle, but started losing the cultural war, one arrow at a time. Sometimes the most effective resistance is dying so spectacularly that people can't stop talking about it for the next 1,000 years. You're standing on Stamford Bridge on September 25th, 1066, watching the last great Viking raid on England turn into an improvised action movie starring one nameless berserker who apparently didn't get the memo about tactical retreats. The Norwegian army under Harald Hardrada, whose name literally means hard ruler, because Viking parents believed in truth in advertising, has been caught with their metaphorical pants down. Actually, scratch that metaphor. Many Vikings are literally without their armor, having left it with the ships on this unseasonably hot September day. They're about to learn why dress for the job you want should include bring your chainmail to the invasion. The mainstream historical fact is that Stamford Bridge marked the end of the Viking Age in England. Though nobody knew it at the time, King Harold Godwinson of England has just force-marched his army 185 miles in 4 days, which is the medieval equivalent of teleporting behind someone and saying, "Nothing personal, kid." The Vikings, who've been lounging around after their victory at Fulford, are about to experience what military historians call getting absolutely bodied. But here's where our hero enters, if you can call a nameless psychopath wielding a two-handed axe a hero. As the English army approaches the bridge, this absolute unit of a Viking realizes someone needs to hold the choke point while his comrades scramble to form battle lines. What follows is 40 minutes of the most metal last stand in military history. This man, whose name history forgot but whose actions it couldn't, turns a narrow bridge into his personal dance floor, and the dance is murdering everyone who tries to cross. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Contemporary accounts can't agree on exactly how many Englishmen this berserker killed, with numbers ranging from 40 to 100. Archaeological evidence from the area shows an unusual concentration of weapon fragments consistent with repeated high-impact strikes on metal armor. In other words, this madman was swinging so hard he was literally breaking other people's weapons with his axe. Some skull fragments show trauma patterns suggesting impacts that would require superhuman strength, leading historians to still argue whether berserkers used performance-enhancing substances or were just powered by pure, distilled crazy. You watch English soldiers approaching the bridge with the confidence of people who outnumber their opponents 5-1. That confidence evaporates faster than morning mist when the first man steps onto the bridge and immediately gets introduced to the concept of bilateral hemispherectomy via axe. The berserker's technique is brutally efficient. He's using the bridge's narrow width to prevent flanking, turning geography into his battle buddy. Every English attempt to rush him results in more bodies clogging the bridge, which actually helps his defense. He's literally building fortifications out of his enemies' corpses. The English try everything. Archers. The berserker's either dodging arrows like he's in the Matrix or just ignoring the ones that hit. Group rushes. He's turned the bridge into a giant's meat grinder. At one point, some bright English soldier suggests using spears to keep distance. The berserker responds by grabbing a spear thrust at him, yanking its owner forward, and demonstrating why reach advantage means nothing when your opponent has opted out of basic self-preservation. The spearman joins the growing pile of extremely dead Englishmen, and everyone else decides maybe spears aren't the answer. The psychological effect is devastating. You've got England's army, fresh from their death march, being held up by one man who's apparently cosplaying as a Norse god of extremely localized violence. English morale is dropping faster than their soldiers. Some are openly admiring the berserker's stamina. 40 minutes of constant combat is impressive even without the killing everyone part. Others are starting to wonder if this is actually fair. There's probably some poor English sergeant trying to maintain order while thinking, I didn't sign up to fight someone who's clearly hacking. Meanwhile, the Norwegian army is using this time to actually get dressed for battle. You can see Vikings strapping on armor while occasionally glancing at the bridge like spectators at a particularly violent sports match. They're cheering their anonymous champion while also thinking, thank Odin that Psycho's on our side. Harald Hardrada is probably composing a saga in his head about this moment, not knowing he'll be dead before sunset, and this berserker will get more historical fame than most named kings. The end comes through treachery or clever tactics, depending on your perspective. An English soldier gets in a barrel and floats under the bridge, because apparently even in 1066, people understood that the best way to deal with a boss fight is to exploit level geometry. He thrusts his spear up through the bridge planks, catching the berserker in the one place his axe can't defend. It's simultaneously brilliant and deeply unsporting, like beating a Dark Souls boss by making it clip through the floor. Historians still argue whether this lone berserker actually changed history. Without his stand, the English might have caught the Norwegian army completely unprepared, turning Stamford Bridge into a rout rather than a battle. Instead, his 40-minute murder monopoly bought enough time for the Vikings to form battle lines, leading to a proper fight that exhausted Harold's army right before some normie named William showed up at Hastings. This nameless Viking's last stand might have indirectly caused the Norman conquest, which is a hell of a butterfly effect from one man with an axe and absolutely zero chill. The bridge is clear now, littered with enough English corpses to stock a medieval medical school, and one Viking who proved that sometimes the power of screw it we ball can briefly stop an entire army. You're standing on the salt marshes near Malden, Essex, on August 10th, 991, watching the English make a tactical decision so catastrophically stupid that military academies still use it as an example of what not to do. Byrhtnoth, the local alderman, is about to let Viking raiders cross a causeway unopposed because of his offer mod. Pride so excessive even medieval chroniclers thought it was a bit much. This isn't just a battle. It's a masterclass in how medieval honor codes can get everyone killed when applied to people who think fair play is something that happens to other people. The mainstream historical fact is that the Battle of Malden became one of the most celebrated defeats in English history, immortalized in an old English poem that somehow makes getting your entire army slaughtered sound noble. The Vikings, led by either Olaf Tryggvason or Sveinfork Beard, historians still argue because Vikings apparently didn't always sign their raids, have sailed up the River Blackwater with 93 ships. That's roughly 3,000 Vikings, and they're not here for the Essex countryside's notorious charm. The setup is perfect for the English. The Vikings are trapped on Northey Island, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway that's only passable at low tide. You watch Byrhtnoth's forces holding the causeway entrance, where 3 men can effectively stop an entire army. It's the tactical equivalent of having the high ground. Except the high ground is everywhere, except where your enemies are standing. The smart play is obvious. Keep the Vikings bottled up until they get bored, hungry, or eaten by mosquitoes. Instead, Byrhtnoth is about to make a decision that would make modern military strategists physically ill. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. The Malden poem mentions that Vikings actually asked permission to cross the causeway for a proper battle, and Byrhtnoth agreed. Archaeological surveys of the area confirm the causeway was barely 6 feet wide at high tide, meaning 3 English defenders really could hold off thousands. Some historians argue Byrhtnoth was trying to prevent the Vikings from simply sailing elsewhere to raid. But tide tables from the period suggest he had at least 6 hours to make them really uncomfortable on their island. Instead, he chose honor over, winning. You watch Viking messengers approaching at low tide, probably expecting to negotiate or threaten. Instead, they find Byrhtnoth in full noble warrior mode. The conversation, as recorded in the poem, basically goes, "Vikings, give us gold and we'll leave. Byrhtnoth, come fight us instead. Cowards. Vikings, seriously? But the causeway? Byrhtnoth, no, cross over. Wouldn't be sporting otherwise." The Viking negotiators exchange looks that clearly say, "Is this guy for real?" before heading back to report that the English commander has apparently suffered recent head trauma. The English warriors' reactions range from confusion to horror. You can see veterans who fought Vikings before doing mental calculations. Narrow causeway plus defensive position equals victory. But now, their commander is gesturing magnanimously for the entire Viking army to cross unopposed. One warrior mutters something about offermod that definitely isn't complimentary. Another is already eyeing the escape routes. But most follow their lord's lead because that's what honor demands, even when honor is clearly suffering from heat stroke. The Vikings can't believe their luck. They're being invited to leave a terrible tactical position for free. It's like your enemy volunteering to fight you in an open field when they have a fortress. You watch them crossing the causeway with expressions ranging from suspicion to barely suppressed glee. Some are probably wondering if this is an elaborate trap. Others are already picking out which English warriors they want to fight. Olaf or Svein or whoever's leading is probably composing a thank you saga to whatever god arranged for the English to be commanded by someone with more pride than brain cells. Once the Vikings form up on the mainland, the battle proceeds exactly as anyone with functional pattern recognition could predict. The English fight bravely. The poem spends hundreds of lines on individual acts of heroism, but courage doesn't overcome terrible tactical decisions. Byrhtnoth himself falls relatively early, hit by multiple Viking weapons because apparently he was also too proud to wear proper armor. His death triggers a partial English collapse, with some warriors fleeing and others forming a last stand around their fallen leader's body. The poem tries to make this last stand sound glorious. And sure, fighting to the death over your dead lord's body has a certain romantic appeal. But you're watching exhausted Englishmen getting methodically butchered by Vikings who can't believe they're getting a proper battle instead of a frustrating standoff. One English warrior named Beardwald gives a speech about hearts growing harder as strength fails, which sounds poetic until you remember it's being said over a pile of corpses that didn't need to exist. Historians still argue whether Byrhtnoth's decision was noble or stupid, but watching it happen, the answer seems pretty clear. His offermod turned a defensible position into a slaughter, his men into martyrs, and Essex into a Viking shopping mall. The defeat leads directly to the first Danegeld payment, because nothing says we're weak, like letting invaders cross a defended bridge for free, then losing anyway. The Battle of Maldon becomes legendary, but it's the kind of legend that makes you wonder if medieval poets were paid by the irony. Honor is all well and good, but when you're facing Vikings, maybe save the chivalry for people who won't use your courtesy as a stepladder to murder you. You're walking through the streets of Jorvik, in 1016, and the transformation is complete. What was once a respectable English trading town is now indistinguishable from any Scandinavian settlement, except with worse weather and more linguistic confusion. Children are playing in the streets, but their games involve wooden swords and elaborate reenactments of raids. The language you hear is more Norse than English, peppered with enough loan words to make linguists weep with joy. England hasn't just been raided by Vikings, it's been fundamentally rewired, and the change is permanent. The mainstream historical fact is that Viking influence on England went far beyond burning monasteries and stealing silver. By the 11th century, Norse DNA was spreading through the population faster than a medieval plague, but with better long-term outcomes. Place names across northern and eastern England are permanently Scandinavian. Any town ending in by, Thorpe or Thwaite, is basically flying a linguistic Viking flag. The English language itself is now an Anglo-Saxon Norse hybrid. Like someone forced Old English and Old Norse to have a baby, and that baby turned out surprisingly functional. You pass a market where English and Norse merchants are haggling in a pidgin that would make proper grammarians sob, but it works. An English farmer is buying an axe from a Norse blacksmith, communicating through a combination of broken Norse, mangled English, and aggressive hand gestures. The word knife comes from the Norse nifr, and you watch someone literally teaching an English child this new word for the cutting thing they've been using their whole life. The linguistic conquest is happening one vocabulary word at a time. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Modern English speakers use Norse words every single day without realizing it. They, them, and their. Norse, skill, skin, skull, Norse, berserk, ransack, slaughter. Definitely Norse. And the Vikings made sure English needed lots of words for violence. Even the word law comes from Norse, which is ironic, considering Vikings introduced themselves to England by breaking most of them. Linguists estimate that over 1,000 common English words have Norse origins, meaning Vikings conquered English more thoroughly than they ever conquered England. The legal system has been transformed too. You're watching a local thing, a Norse assembly, where disputes are settled by a jury of peers rather than trial by ordeal. This Scandinavian innovation will eventually become a cornerstone of English common law, though nobody mentions that Vikings invented it while taking a break from recreational homicide. An Englishman is currently arguing his case using Norse legal terms because they're more precise than English equivalents. The Vikings didn't just raid England's wealth, they upgraded its operating system. The cultural fusion is everywhere. English nobles are wearing their hair in Norse styles, long in front, short in back, what future historians will call the reverse mullet of cultural capitulation. English women are adopting Norse jewelry styles, probably because Norse women had better accessory options, what with their husbands constantly bringing home looted bling. Even English Christianity has absorbed Norse influences. You pass a church where the carved crosses feature interlacing patterns that scream Scandinavian design sense louder than an IKEA catalogue. But the real transformation is psychological. England has developed what historians still argue whether to call Viking PTSD or adaptive survival strategies. Every coastal settlement has watchmen scanning for dragon ships. Children's nursery rhymes include warnings about Norse raiders. The English have incorporated the constant threat of Viking violence into their worldview like background radiation, always there, occasionally lethal, weirdly normal. One generation's existential terror has become another's Tuesday afternoon. The Danelaw, the region under Norse control, has introduced concepts that seem radical to English sensibilities, but normal to Norse ones. Women have more property rights here, probably because Viking women needed legal protection, while their husbands were off raiding for years at a time. Slavery is actually declining in Norse areas, not from moral awakening, but because Vikings realized free tenants work harder than thralls. It's social progress driven by economic pragmatism, which is the most Viking thing ever. You're witnessing the birth of a hybrid culture that will outlast both its parents. The Norman conquest is coming. William the Conqueror is himself descended from Vikings, because of course he is, and it will layer French influence over this Anglo-Norse mixture. But the Viking impact is already baked in, harder to remove than bloodstains from monastery floors. England will never be purely Anglo-Saxon again. It's been permanently infected with Norse DNA, language, and attitude. The Vikings came as raiders and stayed as neighbors, traders, farmers, and eventually just those guys with weird names who lived down the street. Their longships brought death, but their settlements brought linguistic diversity, legal innovation, and genetic variety. They turned England from an insular island into a cultural mixing bowl. Though they used axes instead of spoons to do the stirring, the terror raids are ending not because England defeated the Vikings, but because England absorbed them, like an anthropological immune system that defeats invaders by making them family. Standing in York streets, you realize the Vikings won something more permanent than any military victory. They inserted themselves into England's cultural DNA, changing everything from how English people speak to how they govern themselves. The monasteries have been rebuilt, the gold reaccumulated, the wounds scarred over. But every time an English speaker says they went berserk, they're speaking Viking. The raids are over, but the conquest is complete, measured not in burned churches, but in borrowed words, mixed bloodlines, and a permanently altered civilization. The Vikings haven't left England, they've become it. Now let me settle you gently into sleep with the wind down, as you drift back from those blood-soaked shores and burning monasteries. Let the sounds of the modern world slowly replace the clash of steel and cries of battle. The dragon ships fade into the mist of history, their carved prows becoming nothing more than museum pieces and old stories. Your breathing deepens as you leave behind those desperate monks and fierce warriors, all of them now just whispers in chronicle pages. The violence that once painted England's coasts red has long since washed away, leaving only the faintest traces in place names and DNA. In words you speak without thinking, and laws you follow without knowing their origin. Those terrifying raiders became farmers, those savage warriors became neighbors, and time, that greatest of healers, transformed even the bloodiest history into bedtime stories. Feel yourself sinking deeper into comfort as centuries compress into moments. The Viking age dissolves like morning fog, and you're safe in your bed, far from any longship's reach. No axes gleam in the darkness. No dragon prows cut through the waves seeking your shore. Just the gentle rhythm of your own breathing, carrying you down into peaceful sleep, where the only battles are forgotten by morning. Let go of those ancient terrors. They can't touch you here, in this quiet moment between waking and dreams. History holds them safe in its pages while you float free, descending into rest. The monks found peace eventually. The Vikings found home, And now you too can find that deep, restful place where even the most frightening stories become just distant echoes, fading, fading into gentle darkness. Sleep now. The raids are over. History keeps its ghosts, and you are safe, drifting into dreams where the only ships are made of clouds, and the only sound is your own steady breathing, carrying you softly into the night.